sister announced she was getting the house at 3:20 in the afternoon on a Saturday in February. We had been at my parents' kitchen table. My mother had been pouring coffee from a small ceramic pot. My father had been buttering a piece of toast. My older sister Aoife had been sitting at the head of the table. My brother-in-law Amon, Aoife's husband, had been next to her. I had been sitting across from them. My mother had called the meeting 2 weeks earlier. She had told me on the phone that she and my father had been wanting to update the family on some small estate planning decisions. She had told me the meeting would be casual. She had told me Aoife and Amon would be there and that I should bring my husband Tag, although Tag had ultimately not been able to come because of a work conflict in Boston. I had driven the 3 hours from Boston to my parents' house in central Massachusetts that morning. I had brought a small bottle of wine as a small thank you for the family meal that had been planned for after the meeting. I had been polite and pleasant during the small lunch we had eaten at 1 in the afternoon. I had been preparing, in the small, careful way I had been preparing for family meetings for years, to absorb whatever announcement my parents had been wanting to make. The announcement had come right after the lunch. My mother had asked everybody to stay at the table for a small conversation. She had then said, in the careful voice she had been using on me my whole life when she had been about to deliver something I had not been prepared for, Aoife, Niam. Your father and I have been thinking carefully about our estate. We have been working with our attorney for the past several months. We have made some decisions. We want to tell you about them today so that there are no surprises later. She had paused. She had taken a small breath. She had then said, we have decided that when we both pass, the house is going to Aoife. Aoife has been the one who has been most present for us in our retirement. Aoife has been the one who is here for her holidays and birthdays. Aoife is the one who has been the kind of daughter we want this house to belong to. Niam, we love you, but you live 3 hours away. You have your own career in Boston. You do not need a house in central Massachusetts. We have left you some smaller things in the will. We hope you understand. I had been quiet for a long moment. I had then said, in the small, clear voice I had been preparing for the previous 15 minutes as I had been listening to the announcement build, Mom, Dad. Before either of you continues, I want to make sure you understand the structural situation about the house. Do you remember what happened 6 years ago, when you almost lost the house to foreclosure? My mother had been quiet. My father had set down the small knife he had been using to butter his toast. I want to tell you what had happened 6 years earlier, and what I had quietly done about it, and what my parents had not understood about what I had done at the time. I want to tell you what I said to them at the kitchen table, after Mother had finished her announcement, and what I pulled out of my small leather folder, and what my mother did when she had finally understood what she had been looking at. I want to tell you because there are people listening to this who have helped a family member out of a financial crisis at significant cost to themselves, and who are now watching that same family member treat the help as something other than what it actually was. I want to tell you what I had done to protect myself, and what I have learned about the difference between a gift and a loan, and about which one you should be offering when somebody in your family asks you for help. Before I do, hit subscribe, and tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a time you helped a family member through a financial crisis. Tell me whether you structured the help as a gift or as a loan. Tell me how the family member eventually treated the help. I read every comment. Now let me back up to the year I had been 28, because the year is when the mortgage problem had started. My name is Niam O'Sullivan. I am 34 years old. I am a tax attorney at a small boutique law firm in Boston. I have been doing this work for the previous 9 years. My job involves advising small businesses and high net worth individuals on the small specific technical questions about how to structure their transactions, their estate plans, and their family financial arrangements in ways that protect them from the small predictable problems that can arise when those structures are not properly designed. The work has been useful for what I am about to tell you. The work had been, in particular, the small specific reason I had known, when my parents had called me in a panic 6 years ago, exactly what kind of help to offer them and exactly how to structure it. My parents had bought their small house in central Massachusetts in 1987 when I had been newly born. The house had been a small 4-bedroom colonial on a 1/4-acre lot. The house had been the only house I and my sister Aoife had ever known as children. My parents had paid off most of the original mortgage over the following decades. By 2018, the remaining mortgage balance had been approximately $194,000 on a house that had been worth approximately $420,000 at the time. My father had been a small high school history teacher for 36 years. My mother had been a small medical office administrator for 28. They had both retired in 2016, at the beginning of their 60s, with modest pensions and a small retirement savings that they had been planning to draw on for the rest of their lives. In 2018, my parents had run into financial trouble. The trouble had been the result of a small combination of factors. My father's pension had been smaller than they had been expecting because of a small calculation error the school district had made, and that had taken years to resolve. The retirement savings they had been counting on had been reduced because they've been investing in a small set of speculative positions that had not worked out. My mother had been having small health problems that had required uncovered medical expenses. The combination had been enough that they had fallen 6 months behind on their mortgage payments. The bank had been preparing to begin the foreclosure process. My father had called me in March of that year. He had been crying on the phone. He had told me they were about to lose the house. He had asked me, in the small breaking voice I had not heard him use in my whole life, whether I would consider helping them. I had been 28 at the time. I had been 3 years into my legal career. I had been making approximately $130,000 a year, which had been a strong salary for somebody 3 years into a legal career, but which had not been the kind of salary that had left me with $194,000 sitting in a savings account ready to deploy on short notice. I had not had $194,000. I had had approximately $83,000 in liquid savings. I had been planning to use those savings as a down payment on my first apartment in Boston, which I had been saving for over the previous 4 years. I had told my father I would think about it. I had told him I would call him back the next day. I had thought about it carefully. I had been wanting to help my parents. I had also been understanding, in the small specific way only a tax attorney can understand these things, that the kind of help I had been able to offer was going to require a careful structure. I had not been able to simply give them the money. The amount had been too large. The kind of help that came as a no-strings-attached gift had been the kind of help that families later reorganized themselves around, in ways that had been damaging to the giver. I had decided, after thinking about it overnight, to offer my parents a specific kind of help. I had decided to offer them a secured loan. The loan would be in the full amount needed to pay off their mortgage and to bring their other small overdue obligations current. The amount had eventually come to $186,000. The loan would be structured as a formal promissory note, with a small interest rate that had been below the market rate at the time, but that had been at the minimum applicable federal rate to avoid any small tax complications. The loan would be secured by a lien against the house, recorded at the county registry. The loan would have no scheduled payments during my parents' lifetimes. The loan, including accumulated interest, would become due either upon the sale of the house or upon the death of the surviving parent, whichever came first. I had explained the structure to my parents on a phone call. My father had been confused. My father had been expecting me to offer either a gift or to refuse. My father had not been expecting a structured legal arrangement. He had asked me why I was making it so complicated. I had told him, in the small careful voice I had been preparing, that I had been making it complicated because the alternative would have been worse. I had told him that if I had given them the money as a gift, I would have been transferring my entire savings to them with no protection for myself. I had told him that I had been wanting to help them, but that I had also been wanting to make sure I was not making a decision at 28 that I would regret for the rest of my life. I had told him that the loan structure would let me help them, would let them keep the house, would not require them to make any payments during their lifetimes, and would simply require that the loan be repaid out of the eventual proceeds of the house when it was eventually sold. My father had agreed. My mother had agreed. The two of them had been desperate. The two of them had also not understood, at the time, what the agreement had been committing them to. I had retained a small careful estate attorney in Massachusetts to handle the documentation. The attorney had been a woman named Ms. Inga Solberg, who had specialized in small family financial transactions for the previous 28 years, and who had been recommended to me by a colleague at my firm. Ms. Solberg had drafted the promissory note. Ms. Solberg had prepared the mortgage that would secure the loan. Ms. Solberg had recorded the mortgage with the county registry on a Tuesday in May of 2018. The amount of the recorded mortgage had been $186,000. The lender of record had been me. The borrower had been my parents. I had then transferred the money. I had used my entire savings of $83,000. I had taken out a small personal loan from my own bank for the additional $103,000, which I had been able to qualify for because of my income and credit at the time. I had paid the personal loan back over the following 6 years through small monthly payments from my salary. The personal loan had been my own private burden. I had not told my parents that I had taken it out. The funds had been transferred to my parents' bank account on a Friday in May. My parents had immediately paid off the mortgage. The original mortgage had been cleared. The foreclosure process had been halted. The house had been saved. My parents had been profoundly grateful. In the small, immediate way, they had been grateful. My mother had cried on the phone. My father had told me he would never forget what I had done. The gratitude had lasted approximately 8 months. The gratitude had then begun to fade. The fading of the gratitude had been the small, slow process I had been watching with my professional eye for the previous 6 years. I had been watching my parents reorganize their understanding of what had happened in 2018. I had been watching them begin to talk about the mortgage payoff as a small private family matter that had been handled, rather than as a structured loan that had been documented and recorded. I had been watching them refer to me, at family events, as the daughter who had been generous with her parents during a difficult time, in ways that had subtly suggested I had been giving rather than lending. I had not corrected the small representations at the time. I had been waiting. I had been understanding, in the small, clinical way I had been able to understand these things from my professional work, that the misrepresentations had been the small, early indicators of what my parents would eventually do with the situation. I had been right about what they would eventually do. I want to tell you about my sister Aoife, because the sister had been the part of this story that mattered most. Aoife is 3 years older than me. She is 37. She had been the favored daughter in our family for as long as I could remember. Aoife had been living about 20 minutes from our parents for the previous 15 years. Aoife had been the one who had been at family events. Aoife had been the one who had been involved in the small daily life of my parents in a way I had not been able to be from Boston. Aoife had also been, throughout my parents' financial crisis in 2018, the daughter who had not been able to help. Aoife had been a small elementary school teacher. Aoife and her husband Eamon had been raising 3 children. Aoife had been making approximately $54,000 a year at the time. Aoife had not had the savings to help my parents in any meaningful way. Aoife had been honest about this. Aoife had told me, on a phone call during the crisis, that she had been wishing she could help, that she had been grateful I had been in a position to help, and that she had been hoping the family would survive the situation. I had appreciated Aoife's honesty at the time. I had not been resentful of her inability to help. I had understood that Aoife had been doing what Aoife had been able to do, which had been the small daily presence in my parents' life that I had not been able to offer from Boston. What I had not been understanding at the time was that Aoife's small daily presence had been the foundation of a different kind of contribution to my parents' lives that my parents would eventually decide was worth more than the financial contribution I had been making. I want to tell you what happened at the kitchen table after my mother had made her announcement about the house going to Aoife. I had asked my mother whether she remembered what had happened 6 years ago. I had asked her in the small, clear voice I had been preparing. My mother had been quiet. My father had set down his knife. My mother had said, in the careful voice she had been using for this particular subject, Lien, we are grateful for what you did. We have never forgotten. But that was 6 years ago. We have moved on. Aoife has been here for us in the ways that matter now. We have decided what we have decided. I had said, Mom, I want to clarify something. What I did 6 years ago was not a gift. It was a loan. The loan is documented. The loan is secured by a recorded lien against the house. The lien is at the county registry. The lien has been there since May of 2018. The lien needs to be paid off before the house can be transferred to Aoife or to anybody else. The lien has been accumulating interest at the minimum applicable federal rate for the past 6 years. The current balance, including accumulated interest, is approximately $221,000. The lien is a legal obligation. The lien is not subject to your estate planning preferences. I want you to understand this before we go any further with the conversation. My mother had stared at me. My father had stared at me. Aoife had said in a small, confused voice, Lien, what are you talking about? There is no lien. Mom and Dad paid off the mortgage. I had reached into my small leather folder. I had pulled out a small set of documents. I had set them on the kitchen table. I had said, Aoife, these are copies of the original promissory note from May of 2018, the recorded mortgage at the County Registry from the same month, and a small summary of the accumulated balance through this month. The documents show that the mortgage Mom and Dad paid off 2018 was the bank's mortgage. The mortgage they replaced it with was my mortgage. The mortgage has been there for 6 years. The mortgage has not been paid down at all because the structure of the note did not require any payments during Mom and Dad's lifetimes. The balance has been growing because of the interest. The mortgage is a real mortgage. The mortgage is a real legal claim against the house. I am sorry you have not been told about this. I had been assuming Mom and Dad would tell you at some point. They had not apparently been planning to. Aoife had picked up the documents. She had read them carefully. Aoife had been a competent woman who had been used to reading small specific documents in her own work at the school. Aoife had read the documents the way Aoife had read most things, which had been thoroughly and without rushing. Aoife had finally looked up. She had been quiet for a moment. She had then said, in a voice that had been smaller than the voice she had been using at the table earlier, "Mom, Lien is right. There is a recorded mortgage. This is a real legal document. The house has a lien against it. The lien is for over $200,000. You did not tell me about any of this." My mother had started crying. My mother had been crying in the careful performative way she had been using for years, when she had been confronted with a piece of information that had been inconvenient to the small story she had been telling herself. My father had been still staring at me. My father had said, in a voice that had been smaller than the voice he had been using at the table earlier, "Niam, why did you record the mortgage?" I had told him the truth. I had told him I had been a tax attorney. I had told him I had been 28 at the time of the loan and had been making one of the largest financial decisions of my life. I had told him I had been wanting to help them, but had also been wanting to protect myself from the possibility that the help would be later treated as something other than what it had been. I had told him I had recorded the mortgage because the recording had been the standard way to make sure that the legal nature of the loan would survive any small future family disputes about what the help had actually been. I had told him I had hoped, when I had been recording the mortgage in 2018, that the recording would never need to be relevant. I had told him I had been wrong about that. The recording had been relevant today. The recording was the small specific reason today's conversation was going to end differently than my mother had been planning for it to end. My mother had stopped crying. My mother had said, in the voice she sometimes used when she had been confronted with a situation she had not been able to control through her usual methods, "Niam, what do you want us to do?" I had told her I had two specific things I wanted her to do. The first thing was that I wanted her and my father to update their estate planning to reflect the actual legal situation. The will could still leave the house to Aoife if my parents had been wanting that. The house would, however, be subject to the recorded mortgage. Aoife would receive the house with the lien attached. Aoife would then be responsible for either paying off the lien when she eventually sold the house, or for paying it off as part of the inheritance process if she had been wanting to keep the house, or for refinancing the house to pay off the lien if she had been wanting to do that. The choice would be Aoife's. The choice would not be free. The choice would involve approximately $221,000 of obligation that would need to be addressed. The second thing I wanted was for my parents to acknowledge, in writing, in a small document that Ms. Solberg would prepare for their signature, that the loan from 2018 had been a loan rather than a gift, and that my contribution to the family at that time had been a structured legal transaction rather than the small generous family gesture they had been representing it, as for the previous 6 years. The acknowledgement would be the small specific piece of documentation that would prevent any future family member from claiming, after my parents' deaths, that the loan had not been what it had been. The acknowledgement would not be public. The acknowledgement would simply be a small piece of paper in Miss Solberg's file. My mother had nodded slowly. My father had nodded too. The two of them had not been able to argue with what I had been asking for. The two of them had also been understanding, in the small, slow way they had been understanding it, that the situation had been clarified in a way that they would not be able to unclarify. Aoife had been quiet through most of the second half of the conversation. Aoife had then said, in a voice that had been thoughtful, "Niam, I want to say something. I had not known about the loan. I had been believing Mom and Dad when they had been telling me, for the last 6 years, that you had been generous with them. I had been thinking of you as the daughter who had been kind. I had not been thinking of you as the daughter who had been doing something a daughter should not have had to do at 28. I am sorry I had not understood what had happened. I am sorry I had been part of the story Mom and Dad had been telling. I want you to know that I had not known. I had told Aoife I had been hearing her. I had told her I had not been blaming her for not knowing. I had told her I had been grateful she had been able to read the documents and to understand what they had meant. I had told her I had been grateful she had been honest just now about what she had been understanding. I had then stood up. I had picked up my small bag. I had told my parents I would be in touch with Miss Solberg the following week about the documentation I had been asking for. I had told them I would be available to discuss the situation further if they had needed to discuss it, but that today's meeting was over. I had walked out of the house. I had driven back to Boston that evening. I want to tell you what has happened in the 9 months since the kitchen table meeting. My parents had executed the acknowledgement Miss Solberg had prepared. The acknowledgement had been signed in Miss Solberg's office about 6 weeks after the meeting. My parents had not been happy about signing it. My parents had signed it anyway, because the alternative had been a small legal proceeding that would have been embarrassing for them and that they would have lost. My parents had updated their estate planning. The new will still left the house to Aoife, but the will now explicitly acknowledged the lien and the obligation that would come with the inheritance. Aoife had been informed of the updated terms. Aoife had accepted them. Aoife had been thinking about what she would eventually want to do with the house when the time came. Aoife had told me in a phone call several months ago that she had been thinking about asking me whether I would consider selling the lien back to her at a discount when she eventually inherited the house, so that she could have a clean title without the obligation. I had told her I would be open to discussing it when the time came. We had not yet had the discussion in any specific way. My relationship with my parents has been distant. The distance has not been hostile. The distance has been the small, careful distance of a daughter who had been forced to handle a family conversation legally rather than emotionally, and who had been understanding what the requirement to handle it legally had revealed about the family she had been raised in. My parents had been calling me about once a month. I had been answering when they had called. The calls had been polite. The calls had not been warm. Aoife and I have been closer than we have been in years. Aoife had been processing in her own time what she had learned at the kitchen table. Aoife had been understanding, slowly, that the small family story she had been raised inside had been a story that had been distorting both of us in different directions. Aoife had been calling me more often. Aoife and I had been having small, careful conversations about what kind of sisters we had been raised to be, and about what kind of sisters we might be capable of being now that we had been seeing the family more clearly. The conversations had been slow. The conversations had been good. My husband, Tog, has been steady throughout. Tog had been the person I had been telling everything to as it had been unfolding. Tog had not been surprised by any of it. Tog had been telling me for the previous several years that he had been observing my parents' subtle reframing of the loan from 2018, and that he had been worried about where the reframing would eventually lead. Tog had been right. Tog had been gentle about being right. I have been continuing my own work as a tax attorney. I have been advising more clients in the years since the kitchen table meeting about the small specific question of how to structure family financial assistance in ways that protect both the giver and the receiver. I have been telling them my own story, in small, careful terms, when the telling is useful. I have been finding that the story has been resonating with more clients than I would have expected. I want to tell you what I have learned, because the learning has been the foundation of everything I have been thinking about for the past 9 months. The first thing I have learned is that the structure you give to family financial assistance, at the moment you give the assistance, is the structure that will define the family's understanding of the assistance for the rest of your lives together. If you give the assistance as a gift, the assistance will be remembered as a gift. The remembered gift will then be subject to all of the small subsequent reframing that families do when they need to reorganize their internal stories. The gift will become smaller over time in the family's collective memory. The gift will eventually become a thing the family expects you to keep doing because the family will have absorbed the gift into its understanding of what you owe them. If you give the assistance as a structured loan, the assistance will remain a loan. The loan will be documented. The loan will be referenceable. The loan will not be subject to the small subsequent reframing because the documentation will be a small piece of paper that cannot be reframed. The choice between a gift and a loan at the moment you make it is the choice that will the rest of your financial relationship with your family. Please make the choice carefully. Please make the choice with the assumption that your family will, over time, reframe whatever you have done in ways that minimize their obligation and maximize their entitlement. The assumption is sometimes wrong. The assumption is more often right. If you make the choice with the assumption, and the assumption turns out to be wrong, you will have lost nothing by having documented the loan. If you make the choice with the opposite assumption, and the opposite assumption turns out to be wrong, you will have lost everything. The asymmetry of the consequences is the small specific reason the documentation is always the right choice. The second thing I have learned is that the family member who has been receiving credit for being the favored child, in the years after you have helped the family through a financial crisis is not always somebody who has been deliberately taking advantage of the situation. My sister Aoife had been the favored child in the years after 2018. Aoife had been the daughter our parents had been talking about as the present one. Aoife had also not known the truth about what had happened in 2018. Aoife had been hearing the small reframed version my parents had been telling. Aoife had been believing it, because she had been a person who generally believed what her parents had been telling her. Aoife had been complicit in the family pattern without being deliberately part of the manipulation. The complicity had been the small daily complicity that the favored siblings often have in the family stories that their parents construct around them. The complicity had been Aoife's responsibility to address once she had been confronted with the truth. Aoife had addressed it. Aoife had not been defensive. Aoife had acknowledged what she had not known. Aoife had been a different kind of sister than the favored siblings in many family situations turn out to be. If you have a favored sibling who has been benefiting from your parents' distortions of your family history, please consider that the sibling may not be deliberately participating in the distortions. The sibling may simply have been believing what your parents had been telling them. The sibling may, when finally confronted with the truth, be willing to do the small, careful work of understanding what they had been participating in. The sibling may not. Either possibility is worth considering. Either possibility is worth giving the sibling the chance to demonstrate. The third thing I have learned, and the last one I want to give you, is that the moment your family announces something at a kitchen table that depends on your acceptance of a particular framing of past events is the moment when you need to be ready to correct the framing in real time. My mother had announced the inheritance of the house at a kitchen table. My mother had been operating on a particular framing of the 2018 loan. My mother had needed me to continue accepting that framing in order for her announcement to make sense. I had been ready to not accept the framing. I had been ready because I had been carrying the documentation in my small leather folder. The carrying of the documentation had been the small specific preparation I had been doing for years, without knowing exactly when the preparation would eventually be useful. The usefulness had arrived at the kitchen table. The arrival of the usefulness had been the small validation of the years of preparation. If you are in a situation where your family has been a past event in ways that may eventually be used against you, please consider that the reframing will eventually arrive at a moment when your family will be asking you to accept a present consequence that depends on the reframed past. The asking will come at a kitchen table, or at a family meeting, or at a casual phone call. Asking will be casual. The casual nature of the asking will be the disguise. The actual content of the asking will be significant. Please be ready. Please carry the documentation. Please be willing, when the asking arrives, to gently and firmly correct the framing in real time. The correcting will be uncomfortable. The correcting will also be the small specific work that prevents the asking from succeeding. The success of the asking is what your family has been quietly building toward. The failure of the asking is what you are responsible for ensuring. The responsibility is yours. The responsibility cannot be delegated to anybody else in the family. The responsibility ends with you. The ending of it is the small, specific work that protects everything you have built since the original event the family has been reframing. Protect it. The protection is the inheritance you give yourself in exchange for the years of work you have already done. The protection is worth more than the inheritance the family had been planning to give you instead. I want to ask you something before you go. Tell me in the comments about a time you helped your family financially and later watched them reframe your help in ways that minimized your contribution. Tell me what they said about it. Tell me whether you ever corrected the reframing. Tell me what happened when you did. There are more of us than the families who have been reframing our contributions would ever guess. We have been carrying the small, careful documentation of what we actually did for years, in small leather folders and in small filing cabinets and in small encrypted drives. We have been ready for the moment when the reframing would eventually arrive at a kitchen table. Tell me yours. I will be reading every single comment. I will see you in the next one.